summers in my teenage years, they varied quite a bit. Sometimes I'd be using my computer day in and day out, never getting anything even close to a tan. Other times I would be exploring mountains or doing walks around the neighborhood, generally being a kid as kids are usually expected to be. But somehow, around 12, I had this idea that I picked up. I wanted to go to summer camp. This turned out to be one of the greater and one of the worst ideas that I ever had. I'm Jason Scott. You're listening to Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting out of debt. Huge thanks to Daniel Boyd, Jeff Atwood, and the hundreds of other Patreon supporters who are helping to make this possible. Now, when you get a computer magazine in the 1980s, of course it's got all sorts of columns for you to read, and it's got programs for you to type in, get wrong, and type in again. But it also has ads. And advertisements inside of a computer magazine are probably the real heart of it. They promise so much. Each one of them is the individual work of a place somewhere that is maybe a few people inside of an office, but they make themselves seem like an industrial-level organization that can handle anything you can throw at them. But in the back of a computer magazine would be the cheap ads. I didn't know they were that, but they were the ads that didn't cost quite as much, could be stacked up one after another. They were placed at the end of the printing so that they would be easiest to put in, and they would only cost maybe a few $100, and you would get some pretty obscure and weird places. And that's where you would see the computer summer camps. Summer camps are a decades and decades old idea. Kids would be packed up, thrown into some car, taken to some obscure area, and left there for anywhere from a couple weeks to a couple months, doing swimming, sports, hiking, activities. It was this dream idea. Most of my awareness of what summer camps were came from movies like Meatballs and Gorp, where it would just be this interesting location of cabins and greenery and kids running around, and something about that just really appealed to me. I think I like the idea of the isolation, of being outdoors in the abstract. And in the back of the computer magazines, they would advertise computer camps, camps that would be like regular summer camps, these dreamlands of fun and sun and activities, combined with computers, learning computer languages, maybe becoming truly proficient in this thing I loved. This was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to me, a perfect combination. I loved the idea that maybe I would be spending half the day becoming a major computer ninja, only to run outside and have an incredible game of kickball or go hiking somewhere. So this was something I started to push on my dad, and nobody can push on a parent like a kid with a mission, with an aggregated, perfect idea and the portfolio of what they want to have happen. And my portfolio was, look at this ad for a summer camp. Look what they're proposing. This is a great idea. Now, my father, who at the time I think is 42, he's thinking, wow, summer camp, that's expensive. Because as soon as you started to look into these camps, especially the ones who had grafted a computer course onto their regular activities that had been around for a few decades, you realized how expensive they were. 4 figures to get somebody out, put them up, give them all of the sports and hire all of the staff. This was all stuff that I didn't understand. I didn't understand that it would be a notable amount of my father's salary to send one of his kids, never mind that there were 3 of them. So his jury was pretty out on this, and I had been begging for this for a couple years. But in 1982, my father finally announced that we were going to get to go to a camp. I think it was the shared custody arrangement where my father would get one of us for a month and then my mother would get us for one of the months. That was a lot to ask, especially because my father had this busy job at IBM. So he was actually for the idea of us spending a few weeks out there in a camp. And here's where the bait and switch happened. Okay, so I had this vision of summer camp, both created by film, which always made things look better than they did, and what I would read in these breathless ads in the computer magazines. But what my father did was send his kids to a nearby camp called Surprise Lake Camp. And Surprise Lake Camp, this is upstate New York, was not the fun and sun place that I had dreamed inside of my mind over a couple years. No, it was not. But let's step back for a moment. If you're going to camp, if you haven't done this, I've listened to some interesting descriptions of summer camps over the years, and it seems like there's two different types of people when it comes to summer camps. Either it's a life-defining moment that they went to year after year and it became part of their character and spirit. And then there were people for whom summer camp never happened. It was something some of the kids in the neighborhood did, and they would disappear for a couple months and come back. And it was just this nebulous idea of camp, also perhaps colored by these Hollywood movies. And like everything else, for me it was escape. I was absolutely determined to get away from terrible school years and do something fun and interesting with my summers. So summer camp both appealed to me and became a part of my life. And again, not to throw anything on my dad, he was trying to find the most cost-effective way to get 3 kids into summer camp at the same time. And what he had done was book us at a nearby camp. And this camp, Surprise Lake Camp, well, it was a camp for kids from New York City who didn't have money, who were Jewish, who wanted to experience outdoors maybe the only time they really would during the entire year. In other words, my father took 3 of his suburban, soft kids and threw them into a mosh pit of angry, weird, young kids from the city who had their own ideas of what was fun, what they wanted to be part of, and what they thought of a kid like me. Now, I don't have the benefit of looking back over the years and understanding what kind of image I projected to others. I've gotten the impression ambiently that I was pretty weird. I was a little bit introverted. I had terrible hair. I had this look I would give people, and I wouldn't break eye contact. I was very intense and odd, kind of pushed away off to the side on his own little projects and always in my head, always coming up with ideas inside of my head creatively. So when I got dumped into Surprise Lake Camp, I guess I really didn't understand who I was. But suburban kids are soft. We're super soft. My brother and sister and I, we had our little bits of weirdness and things we were into and our ability to stand up for ourselves, but that's nothing compared to a kid from the city. And so when I was put into my cabin, my bunk, with 3 other kids, we proceeded to not get along. In fact, I started to not get along with everybody. A quick rundown of how summer camp is for somebody who hasn't been there, or maybe a refresher course if you had. You wake up, usually cold, inside of a bunk that's made out of wood with screens, that's got no actual heat or ability to cool anything. And you get up, and there's usually some sort of showers that are down a path. So you go down the path, you take a shower, it's a group shower. You come out, then you go back up the path, you get dressed, and then you've got to be in for breakfast within a certain time. There's a heavily regimented schedule, not unlike prison, and you get this amount of time to get your food, get something to eat, and then you get out, and then there'll be classes waiting for you. And these classes ranged. Some of them were swimming, doing some sort of game or activity. They weren't really things for introspection. They were meant to give you activity, literally physical activity or interacting, and maybe a slight amount of competitiveness, but not too much competitiveness. You might find yourself doing baseball games. You might find yourself doing walks or running. And of course, the counselors, who are the people who are watching over you, These are kids too. They're anywhere from their early 20s to their early 30s, but usually by that time you either get a better paying job for the summer or you've become management and you don't go out and do it. So very young people who are getting involved. And, one of the side effects of that is they each have very distinct personalities. And as long as they're not doing something radically terrible, they're usually given a lot of leeway as leaders. And so their styles would range much like teachers might. And so you would have this heavily regimented day that was broken up by a breakfast, a lunch, and a dinner. And then, of course, as I discovered, there were all sorts of barriers and concerns that were placed on the outer sides to catch any kids that were falling between the cracks. In other words, like if a kid was not participating in activities or if a kid was acting out with other kids, it would fall to the counselors or the head counselor of that group to step in and fix things. Now, I didn't get along with my bunkmates. I've long ago lost their names. In fact, and let's be absolutely clear, I hated Surprise Lake Camp. I hated everything about it. I hated the stuff we were made to do. I hated the attitude of everybody. I hated the way the kids were. This summer camp was like the classic devil's bargain of everything I wanted given to me in exactly the way I didn't want it. Did I get to go out and do fun sports? Yes. But was I good at sports? Worse than terrible. Would I be able to walk around and get lots of exercise? Yes. But after sleeping in a terrible bunk and eating food that was just above prison grade, did I have the energy to do so? No. As I said before, it was a Jewish camp. It was a camp that had kids who were Jewish who came from New York City. And I'm Jewish. I'm certainly Jewish by birth. And I had, at that point, kind of drifted away from the idea of going on with my bar mitzvah and really becoming, full-fledged and continuing to really honestly take any interest in religion whatsoever. I'd kind of walked away from that. And that was a major problem for my dad. You need to understand that my great-uncle Sam, he had actually climbed over a fence of a concentration camp when he was being held to be brought in, and he had escaped from Europe. He had numbers on his arm, and my grandfather and grandmother had died a couple years before I was born. And the family in my father's generation was in a lot of disarray because of that. And so I think my father felt that a lot of our identity and a lot of our culture was going to be dissipated, and that if he didn't do something to kind of pass it on to his children, it would be lost. And I think it meant a lot to him, that we would have that, but I also think it wasn't dominating him. Like my father wasn't forced into, a level of orthodoxy that would make it so that it was his entire life. My father had, in his own way, kind of drifted. And I think as a result, this was his last big attempt, was leave his kids among a Jewish summer camp, and maybe some of it would hold. Mostly how that would portray itself for me was that the camp rabbi would do the morning and lunch and, the meal prayers. I never had anybody ask to counsel me. I remember that one of my bunkmates was still learning his words for his bar mitzvah, so he was practicing his Hebrew. But other than that, Jewish identity didn't really push anywhere in this camp. But I assumed the food was kosher, and I assumed that there were some limitations on Saturdays that maybe I didn't notice. But I assure you, it did not take. I was absolutely a miserable kid at this miserable camp. And after a while, the other kids, who were indifferent to me, started to hate me. And again, I'm sure I was no peach to deal with, but one by one they started moving out of the bunk that we shared into another bunk that became more of a party bunk. It started to get 6 and 7 kids instead of the regular 4. So they had a grand old time. They were truly bonding until eventually it was me and one kid, and then that kid finally got into the other bunk. And that was the end of it. Jason alone in his bunk. So one day I came home to the bunk and I discovered a massive tree in it. They had taken some little tree that had fallen and shoved it into the bunk. I got the message pretty quickly. So 2 more things about that camp, and then I'll move on. First of all, There was a kid in the camp who really wanted to kill me. There was a kid who, like the other ones, was obviously from the city. He was some little guy, but he got it in his weird head to start telling me that he was going to kill me. He'd walk by and be like, "Gonna kill you, man. Gonna kill you. I'm gonna kill you." And he'd chase after me with a knife. This sounds like something you should really have been noticing if you were a counselor, but okay. So he would chase me with a knife, and I would usually find a tree, and I would hide up in the tree while he would yell at me. This kind of finally got the attention of the counselors like a week in, and he was quickly shuffled off to wherever he was sent. So having somebody who was stalking me and trying to kill me was definitely not up there. Oh, and the hunger. Did I mention the hunger? Because the food was of a very low grade, I had a lot of hunger at the time. Every waking moment, I just wanted more food. And I wasn't good enough at figuring out which breads and which foods would fill me up, so I would spend a lot of time just waiting for the next meal. And there was a kitchen that had a lock on it that wasn't very good. And I remember this, I'm only mentioning this because it's hilarious. I broke in with the idea of stealing food. So I broke in at night into this kitchen and found a big package of chocolate up in one of the shelves. And I took it down and I took like 3 or 4 quick scoops as greedily as I could, the master thief, before I realized it was cinnamon. Don't eat 4 cups of cinnamon. The mess I made on that kitchen floor was legendary. Okay, so I came back from that experience now hating summer camp. Didn't want anything to do with it. Thought this was the stupidest idea. Who would enjoy this? This was miserable time. Don't want any part of it. And my father understood my feelings about it, and especially about how much I loved computers. So the next year, my father sent me to an honest-to-goodness computer camp, and it was called the Computer Tutor Summer Camp. Now, there's a whole bunch of computer camps that flourish in the early 1980s that faded away, and Computer Tutor appears to be one of them. And what happened, like I said, was that computers were kind of either grafted onto current summer camps, who were more than happy to teach you whatever it thought would get kids into the camp, or they were brand new endeavors that were created specifically around computers, with this idea that your kids should learn this technology of the future. And Computer Tutor was one of those. It was partially sponsored by Nike, and it was affiliated with a tennis camp, I found out later. So it was a tennis camp that also had a computer camp. And so I was dropped off to Williamstown, Massachusetts. And what a beautiful New England town that is in the summer. It was everything you envision with the brick and the clock tower and the little town that was one main street. And we were on a college campus, which meant that our bunks were dorms, with the full complement of heat and private showers and a lobby that was meant for college students. And, I just hearkened back to this, a meal card. An honest-to-goodness meal card like they have in college, where you swipe once at the door and then it's all you can eat of the most amazing meals until you are so full you can't move. I remember the dessert being particularly delicious. Our lead counselor was this lovely older woman who was kindly and thoughtful and who listened to us. She had 2 counselors under her who were both basically hippies, who were very helpful as well, and cool guys and friendly. And everybody in the camp was kind of like this weird, pasty kid who loved computers most of all. Now, they would actually make us go outside and try tennis or try walking around or being involved in physical activity. But the main deal was this computer lab. And in the computer lab, it was half IBM PCs and half of it Apple IIs. So contrast the day. I'd wake up in the morning. I would be in a dorm. I would get dressed, put on my Computer Tutor shirt, go down to the cafeteria, swipe once, eat like a king, waddle on over to the computer lab. There'd be some rough assignments they'd give us, like write a program that did this sort of thing, or maybe come up with a program and show it to us and we'll encourage you. And I'd hack away at it and save it on my floppy disk. I'd be able to keep my floppy disks with the counselors, and we would just explore the wonders of these Apple IIs and these IBMs. And I remember there was one kid named Phil who was working on a Pac-Man game that was, spectacular for the time. He was using techniques I'd never seen before. I was learning so much. And we'd be trucked off to some activities. I remember once that we ended up at a roller skating rink. I remember that we ended up on this unbelievably dangerous slalom ride that was down the street a few miles, and I would be allowed, I think about this, during my free time to go walking through this little town where there were video games in some of the different businesses. And this is where I first played the game Xevious and Tron. I would go to these little pizza parlors or over to some bookstore, and I would be able to be myself, be my own kid. I felt safe and happy and at ease. And there was this one other little aspect that always amuses me when I look back, which was we were all amazing software pirates. So the two hippie counselors had copy programs, and we would all copy Apple II programs and IBM PC programs. This was the first place that I played the Bilestode, which is an amazing Apple II game, and they would copy it for all of us. And we would each end up with our own small disc collection of wares, which was a delight, just an absolute delight. This, of course, was a big irony during one of the camp get-togethers when the older counselor would explain to us about how we wanted to not become the kind of kids who would pirate games, and that we would maybe learn to be better people by not doing things like pirating games. And all of us are looking at each other and the two perpetrating counselors and, yeah. Anyway, I loved Computer Tutor Summer Camp so much I came back for a second year. It was a beautiful place with beautiful people and a great time. And I think about those kids often. We were given ways to write to each other afterwards. I didn't really do that except for to call Phil a couple times. I kind of got wrapped up after I came back the second time to go move into my nicer school that I've described before. And that school, in its own way, had all sorts of activities for me to get involved in. So I drifted away from summer camp. I didn't need a place to hide. I didn't need a refuge from life. Life was now something really incredible, and I was grabbing it with both hands, both in the winter and the summer. So really, I am on team summer camp. I think that if you have kids and they're growing up and you want a way to give them something exciting, can't do much better than putting them into some sort of camp, a day camp or a sleepaway camp. Make computers part of what they learn or whatever else they want to learn, and give them a way of learning to deal with other people that they don't know, not in an academic setting, but with the idea of growing up and sharing knowledge and sharing experiences and maybe gaining lifelong friends. This is Jason Scott, talks his way out of it. Thanks so much to James Boycayanu, Sam Johnston, Stefan Arentz, Astrid Smith, Kevin Waters, and all the other Patreons who've been helping to make this entire podcast a reality. It has a Patreon. That's patreon.com/textfiles. I'm using this to pay off debt. If you have $1 that you want to give per episode, that works for me. People who give more than that, they have different levels, but the fact is that every single person who's contributing toward this is making a massive change in my life. There are bills that I used to be terrified of looking at. I'd see them in my drawer. I wouldn't know where I would ever get that amount of money. And you guys are helping me to vanquish them like dragons. It's a load off my mind, and I hope it reflects itself in the amount of productivity and projects that I will be getting done in the coming years. Thanks again so much for this.